Okay, very quickly today, we're going to go through the aspects of public policy. And of course, we're talking about this with the president and Congress in this unit because, of course, the laws Congress passes will become policy when it comes to the execution of that law through the executive branch. Okay. So here in between, so to speak, the presidency and Congress, those two parts of this unit, I want us to talk about policies and how those get implemented. So first, let's talk about the cost or the burden of the policy and who benefits. Remember, we talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about politics, right? So we had some political theories. So majoritarian politics would be where everyone benefits and almost everyone pays, right? These are things like Social Security, right? Everybody benefits from it in some way, and almost everybody pays for it, right? So there is, though, however, a problem with the free rider, a person that will benefit from it but does not pay. But for the most part, majoritarian would be something where the will of the people is represented through these officials and through referendums or popular votes and initiatives, and they are, like I said, widely distributed, and the costs are also widely distributed. Okay, so majoritarian example would be Social Security. Okay, the elite policies, this would be what we would call distributive. All right, so the people with more resources dominate. Remember, there are concentrated benefits and distributed cost in this aspect. And so if we look at oil producers, farm subsidies, things like that, we have a small group of people benefiting, but everyone is paying for it. Okay, so these we could also call this special interest, right? So it's a small elite group of people making these decisions and these policies when everyone is paying for them. Okay, all right. Then the next thing, interest group policies. This is known as sort of the regulatory side of things. Um, when you have a an interest group who pushes for legislation, and it's something to benefit that small group of people. And most of the time with interest groups, and this is the difference between that elite group and interest groups, is that the costs are concentrated. So that small group benefits, and another small group would pay for it. Okay, so an example might be something that, let's say, union members in a particular industry benefit from, whatever it might be, and it's paid for by that employer or that company and or the industry. So that small group is paying for it, and that small group is benefiting from it. Okay, so that's the difference between elite and interest. All right, then entrepreneurial. This is also regulatory. This is the interest group sort of policies or politics, but it's directed toward the business side of things, businesses. All right, so there are distributed benefits and concentrated cost. All right, so pretty much everyone benefits, but a particular industry pays for it. An example would be back during this guy named Ralph Nader. He ran for president, but he was very big on getting things passed that benefited consumers, and he also was into the environment as well, but mainly he focused on benefiting the consumer. Okay, and having the that whatever that particular industry was to pay for it, right? So I always think about what I would call like the idiot tags, and I think y'all probably know what I'm talking about here when you have like the hair dryer with the tag on it that says, well, don't use this in the shower, right? So those were things that were paid for by those industries, by those companies, and it was regulations, and it benefited everyone, but those particular companies had to pay for it. A lot of this has to do with environmental protections and like OSHA regulations and things like that. Okay. So those are the types. This is very important for you to know. This is the sequence of creating policy. So this happens in this order. So an issue comes to the government's attention, and I'll show you in just a minute how that happens, but usually through interest groups or parties or both. Then Congress holds committee hearings and hears testimony about whatever the subject might be. Then a bill might be drafted, and usually these bills are actually drafted by those interest groups or the special interest that are trying to get the bill passed. They will actually write the bill for the committee member or for the congressman or senator, and they will introduce that bill on their behalf, right? So the congressional committee helps to draft the bill. The policy is assigned to an agency to implement, of course, after it would not actually implemented, of course, until after the sixth step when it's actually put into law. But they are assigned already during that process to an agency. So you know who's going to carry that out. And of course, that's by subject. Funding for the implementation is decided upon. So that's the appropriation from Congress. All right. So that's the budget for that particular agency is tied to that piece of legislation. And then, of course, the bill is passed, signed into law, and then the government would go through that implementation, the steps to implementation, right? And then, of course, usually afterwards, there might be congressional oversight on that particular issue that we will see. Okay, so that's the steps of creating policy. And this is sort of putting those steps into a graphic here. And this is called the iron triangle. I think we've mentioned this before. So you've got the interest group that brings the particular interest to light. Of course, they do that through lobbying Congress members, specifically those committee members that would take up that legislation. Then, of course, the bureaucracy, that's the governmental agency. So their budget would be tied to what the interest group, wanted to have happen, the policy they wanted to have implemented. So those two, the interest group and the bureaucracy, would work together to get the support of their members of Congress, and then that support would flow the other way as well. Okay, so Congress gives funding and political support to the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy then, in turn, lowers regulations, makes things simple for that particular policy, which affects that interest group. Okay. Then, of course, the interest group also gives electoral support to Congress. So they are giving money and support, campaign contributions, things like that to Congress. Okay, so that's how the iron triangle works. All right, we're going to get into taxing and spending. So obviously, all of these things take money to implement. So where does the money come from? So we're going to talk a little bit about the budget here. This is an example of tax revenue coming into as a part of the federal budget. So sources of the federal budget. So we have individual income taxes coming in that pays for the majority of things that are spent on policy. Then payroll taxes, and then some other things here. Okay, so this was 2017, the federal revenues source. And then, of course, that money is then spent through implementation of the policy. Here's the breakdown of the 2017 federal budget and how the money was spent. So you can see that, for instance, Social Security, and this would be considered mandatory spending. This takes up the largest right now chunk of our federal budget. Second, coming in with Medicare. So that's a lot of the pie right there. Those two are mandatory spending. In other words, when it's mandatory, those numbers cannot be changed unless another separate law from the budget is passed or separate from the spending bill. Okay, so this is money that they don't have a choice in spending unless Congress passes other legislation, okay, to change that. So that's called mandatory spending. And then you can just see the breakdown of the rest of that. So we've got $4.3 trillion spent. Problem with that, if we go back to this one, and this pie chart or this pie is about 3.3 trillion. So we're spending more than we're taking in, right? So if we look at, let's go to, oops, okay, let's go to the debt clock, and I'll put a link to this in that PowerPoint. But so here's the problem. So where does all this money come from that we owe? Well, that's a big part of it. So we have a budget deficit. So U.S. federal debt here, we've got the U.S. federal spending, the budget deficit. So right now we're running at a $3.1 trillion deficit for this particular fiscal year. And you can see what's coming in. So we've got 3 trillion coming in right now. Then it breaks it down, revenue per citizen, income tax revenue, and so forth. So this is a very interesting site to see where the money's coming in and where the money is being spent. Okay, and we'll talk much more about this site as we go, especially when we get into get into economics. Okay, but we'll come back to this when we talk more about the budget and during our Congress unit. All right, but I just wanted to show you that. Okay, so let's see. We are here again with spending. So I mentioned mandatory and discretionary. So discretionary, those are the things that can be spent or can be changed just through the budget bill or appropriations bill and not through a separate law. So things like Social Security and Medicare would be mandatory. Things like military, transportation, things like that would be discretionary. And then there are what we call entitlements. This is where federal money is provided to those who meet an eligibility requirement. Okay, so that would be like Social Security. You have to be eligible, right? Medicare, that's an age eligibility. So those are automatically spent each year without congressional review. In other words, those are mandatory. Okay, so entitlements are mandatory. All right. The next few slides here will go through different policy categories. I'm not going to go through all of these with you. I did create for you a kind of cheat sheet that I put in your notes for some of the laws that you might be asked about on the test. So just go through this and read these and look at the examples of the different policies. There's Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. You may be asked about that. So just read through those and you can see how the policy is enacted and how it is, sorry about that, how it is carried out by the executive branch. And then you'll see some different legislation and these different issues that you might need to be aware of, especially some of these right here. So go through these different policies and the categories and read through that list in your notes, okay? All right, and I'm going to trust you to do that on your own. I do want to talk about a few groups of people here. The economic advisors to the president, we mentioned those a little bit when we talked about the executive office. So that's under also in with the Office of Management and Budget. And then Congress also has an office that is the equivalent, so to speak, of the OMB, and it's called the CBO. So that's the Congressional Budget Office. So when the Office of Management and Budget produces the president's budget, Congress will come out and do research into the budget to make sure that all the numbers are correct on what things will cost. So they will produce sort of a check off of the president's budget to see, that the numbers line up. Okay, and then of course the Secretary of Treasury gets involved in that process as well. All right, economic theory, we want to talk a little bit about that. So this is the taxing and spending, and then versus the monetary policy. So let's talk about taxing and spending first. Keynesian economics, remember when we talked about the differences between the liberals and conservatives, we talked a little bit about this. This is the belief that the government should control the economy through taxes and spending, okay? So if demand is too low, the government should inject money into the economy that in turn creates a snowball effect where the people will get more money through jobs and things like that, and in turn contribute then again to the tax intake. Okay, so that's that government taxing and spending. Okay, a good example of that. So even if it goes into deficit spending, right? So if it requires taking on debt, example would be the New Deal programs. Okay, obviously those were Democratic ideas. So the other side of that is supply side theory. Okay, this would be considered sort of the Republican idea, and also known as trickle down, like we talked about before. And so lowering taxes when the economy is in trouble, lowering taxes, therefore employers will hire more people will receive a paycheck, therefore that tax revenue will increase and so forth. But it's on the supply side instead of on the demand side. Okay, so keeping taxes low incentivizes people to work more and earn more. And so there's that snowball effect as well. Okay. Example would be Reagan's tax cuts. We can update this with Trump's tax cuts. The national debt, of course, will end up in both sides, would end up being more if, let's say that the tax cuts were implemented, but no spending cuts, like in the Reagan years, right? So we have to match those tax cuts with spending cuts, okay? And both of these sides have a problem with that, right? So there's always that debt side of it, that deficit spending side of it. It depends on which side you're having that debt, whether it's caused through lowering taxes or government spending, determines which one we're talking about, right? So we both have that problem on both sides, okay? Another thing we need to mention as far as regulatory with policy is the Federal Reserve System. We're going to talk, we have a whole unit with business and government that we will discuss in economics. So I'm not going to get too much into this here, but just knowing what the Federal Reserve System is. And that consists of the board with the Federal Open Market Committee. And so we talk about this now because this is where the monetary policy comes into play, because the Federal Reserve is responsible for implementing monetary policy. All right, when we say monetary policy, we're talking about controlling the economy through. Okay, sorry about that. So the Fed sets monetary policy by buying and selling securities, government securities. Basically, that's government debt. Regulating money reserves, those are the required amounts of money that have to be in banks. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. And setting interest rates. Okay, so there are 12 Federal Reserve banks or branches, districts that serve as intermediaries for money traveling from the government to the banks. All right, so when we talk about things like, well, okay, the Fed is printing money. Well, what does that actually mean? So that's what we're talking about as far as buying and selling securities. So we're going to talk about how that works. First, though, let me talk about the interest rates. So the Fed sets the interest rates, which is paid for government bonds, in other words, securities, and that determines when we sell or purchase U.S. Treasury bonds, okay, or the debt, right? Bonds are sold and purchased sold to and purchased from individuals. I'll get it out in a minute. Institutional investors and foreign governments. So when we talk about our debt to foreign countries, this is how we owe them that money, right? Because they're buying up our debt through treasury bonds, okay? And also to commercial banks. So we also have financial institutions that buy government debt, also individuals, right? Okay. So the discount rate, this is an interest rate that determines the amount of interest that's charged by the Federal Reserve to banks. All right. So when banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve, this is the amount of interest that's charged to that bank. And we'll get into later why they would do that, why they would borrow that money a little bit later on. Okay. Um, so when the discount rate is lowered, that encourages the banks to borrow money, which allows them to then lower interest rates that they charge their customers for loans, and that increases demand. So in other words, that encourages people to borrow money and to spend money. Okay. So when interest rates are low, that stimulates the economy because people will be more apt to, get a car loan to buy a car, get mortgages to buy a house, to start businesses, things like that. So that has that snowball effect in the economy as well. All right. So getting a little bit into that to understand monetary policy a little more, this is actually the wrong link, but we can look at it through Dropbox. But I meant to change this to my drive, but anyway, we'll be able to see it. So let's talk real quick about fractional reserve banking. Okay, let's see. Let me just open this in Google Slides real quick so we can see it a little bit better. Okay, so let me explain a little bit to you about how those interest rates work and how that regulates the economy. Okay, so we have what's called fractional reserve banking. And basically, this was the idea that banks have to keep a certain percentage of their customers' deposits on hand physically so that we wouldn't have another run on the banks. Okay. And they could loan out the rest. All right, so it's just one of those things that, and they did it actually before the Great Depression, but they really, enforced it and reinforced it after the run on the banks during the Great Depression. Okay, but that interest rate, or I'm sorry, that fractional reserve banking percentage, and that's called the reserve rate. So if the reserve rate is lowered, then that means they can loan out more money, right? So let's just kind of look at how that works. So legal reserves, that's the amount of cash on hand. The required reserves are the percentages of the reserves that must be kept in the bank, okay? So let's talk about blah, 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 blah. All right, let's look at this. All right, so let's say that we had $100,000 and I had it buried in my backyard. It has not been in the banking system. So I go and I decide, okay, I'm going to put this in the bank. So I go to my bank, Bank A, and I put my $100,000 in Bank A. So Bank A has to keep on hand this, it's $10,000 of it, right? So let's say it's 10%, right? So 90,000 of my $100,000 deposit can be used to make loans, right? Or invest in a particular way. So let's say that 90,000 of it is borrowed from Bank A. This is my money, my 100,000. They have to keep 10,000. 90,000 is lent out, okay, through loans. So that money is then put into Bank B, right? They have to keep 10% and can loan out the rest. And it just keeps going and going and going. So this original $100,000 that has entered the economy here in this bank ends up being, if you add all of these together, a lot of money, right? So easily $100,000 can translate into, really, it can just keep going and going and going, but it could be $1 million, right? Okay, so depending on what the reserve rate is. So this money is being put out into the economy. So the lower this percentage rate is, means that more money is put out into the economy. Okay, so that's monetary policy. Another thing, let me skip through some of this stuff. Okay, here we go. So tools that the Federal Reserve uses, we just talked about the reserve requirements. That's what we just talked about. The other thing is the discount rate. Okay, that's that rate rate that banks use to borrow money. So the lower that is, the more money there is in the economy. And then they can buy and sell government securities. That's our government debt. So if they want more money in the economy, then they will expand the money supply, and this is how they do it. They lower the discount rate, lower the reserve requirements, and they buy up government securities. This is what happens when they quote print money. Okay? So if they're buying up government securities, that means they are buying up government debt. All right? So that's putting more money from the government into the economy. Okay? So if they want to tighten up the money supply, they would then do the opposite of those things. They would raise the discount rate, raise the reserve requirement, and sell government securities. Okay, so that's monetary policy versus that taxing and spending that we just talked about. And like I said, we'll get more involved in that when we talk about or when we get into economics. Okay, so you'll understand all that a little bit better. That was just a quick to show you the difference between monetary and taxing and spending. Okay. All right, so that's monetary and fiscal. All right, then that's just what we just talked about. So read through all of that again. This is going through sort of the income tax and how those rates have changed over time. There are the rates again. That was for 2010. I need to update these, but you can just kind of see how income has been taxed by the federal government over time. And we'll talk much more about all of this taxing stuff when we get into economics. All right. Let's say the tax code, other sources of revenue besides income tax, so excise taxes. These are also known as sin taxes. These are like sales taxes on particular items. The states have their own income taxes. So all of these things are money, revenue coming in. The budget process, we'll talk more about when we talk about Congress. But here is the CBO that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and the Impoundment Act that we talked about before. So that's Congress's power of the purse. That's all involved in that policy making. Some federal organizations with budgetary influence. So all of these people are involved in that process. And then the rest of this, I think, is old stuff that I haven't taken out. Going through foreign policy, read over that. And like I said, look at that cheat sheet that I put in your notes. So that's, again, foreign policy. Okay, so like I said, just look over those different policy types and get those examples from your notes. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about policy when we get to Congress as well. Okay? All right.